Why it sucks to be an empress in the Byzantine Empire. You've just watched your own son blinded on your orders. Not metaphorically. Actually blinded to hot iron, held by men loyal to you, in a palace room he once played in as a child. He survives. He does not rule again. And you, his mother, become the first woman in Byzantine history to rule the empire alone, in your own name, with no man above you. This isn't a myth. This is the actual, documented reign of Empress Irene of Athens, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about what it meant to hold power as a woman in the Byzantine Empire. It was real, it was possible, and it was purchased at a price most people today would find almost unimaginable. Today, we're breaking down why being an empress in the Byzantine Empire was one of the most genuinely dangerous positions of authority a woman could hold in the ancient or medieval world, and why the women who succeeded it had to be some of the most ruthless political operators in history. To understand what it meant to be a Byzantine empress, you first need to understand the empire itself, because Byzantine politics operated on a level of institutionalized brutality that made succession genuinely unpredictable. Generation after generation. The Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking, Christian continuation of Rome that lasted for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, never developed a fully stable, universally accepted system for choosing its rulers. Bloodline mattered, but it wasn't decisive. Military support mattered more. The backing of the church mattered enormously. And when those forces disagreed, the result was frequently a coup, a rebellion, or a palace conspiracy. Byzantine political culture developed a specific, chilling solution to the problem of a dangerous rival. Mutilation instead of execution. Blinding, cutting off a nose, or cutting off a hand rendered a man ineligible to rule under Byzantine religious and legal tradition, which required an emperor to be physically whole. This meant a defeated rival, a deposed emperor, or a threatening relative didn't necessarily need to die. He simply needed to be disfigured in a specific, deliberate way that permanently ended his political future. This was the political environment every Byzantine empress had to navigate. Marrying into or being born into this family didn't mean marrying into safety. It meant marrying into one of the most competitive, high-stakes political arenas that has ever existed, one where the losing move could cost you your eyes, your position, or your life. Byzantine empresses arrived at their position through several very different paths, and each path came with its own specific dangers. Some were born into the imperial family, daughters of a reigning emperor, raised from childhood with the expectation of eventually marrying into another powerful dynasty or ruling in their own right if no male heir was available. Others arrived through a system almost unique to Byzantium, the imperial bride show, in which the most eligible young women from across the empire were gathered at the palace so the reigning emperor, or his mother, could personally select a bride based on beauty, intelligence, and family connections. This wasn't romantic courtship. It was a formal, competitive selection process, sometimes involving dozens of candidates paraded before the imperial family in a single event, with your entire future decided by their judgment in the space of an afternoon. Others became empress through a route that sounds almost unbelievable by modern standards. They were sole rulers or co-rulers by right of birth, particularly in the 9th and later centuries, when several women took the throne directly rather than merely marrying into it. And some, like Empress Theodora in the 6th century, arrived from backgrounds about as far from imperial nobility as Byzantine society allowed. Theodora, according to the historian Procopius, worked in the entertainment industry of Constantinople before catching the eye of the future Emperor Justinian, an origin so scandalous by the standards of the aristocracy that Justinian had to personally change Roman law just to make their marriage legally possible, since existing law forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. Whatever the path, one thing was constant. Your position depended entirely on maintaining the loyalty and goodwill of whoever currently held power beside you, and that loyalty could evaporate overnight. Once you were empress, your actual responsibilities varied enormously depending on your personal ambition, your husband's trust in you, and the political climate of the moment. But the ceiling on what a Byzantine empress could achieve was, by the standards of the medieval world, extraordinarily high. At a baseline level, you were expected to manage the imperial household, oversee court ceremony, and critically, produce a male heir. Failure at that last task carried the same devastating consequences it did in nearly every other hereditary monarchy. A childless empress, or one who produced only daughters, faced serious risk of being set aside, sent to a convent, or replaced. But some empresses went dramatically further than this baseline role. Theodora effectively co-ruled with Justinian, and Byzantine sources describe her directly influencing major policy decisions, legal reforms expanding rights for women, and in one specific, well-undocumented moment personally convincing Justinian not to flee Constantinople during the catastrophic Nika riots of 532, when the city was in flames and the emperor was seriously considering escape. Procopius records her declaring that purple, the color of imperial power, makes the finest burial shroud, essentially arguing that dying as emperor was better than living as a fugitive. Justinian stayed. The riots were brutally suppressed. His reign, and by extension Theodora's influence on Byzantine law and architecture, continued for decades afterward. Other empresses acted as regents for underage sons, wielding the full power of the throne during the child's minority, a position that was, in practice, indistinguishable from being sole ruler, except that it existed on a temporary legal fiction that could be revoked the moment the son came of age. This temporary nature of regency power is precisely what set the stage for the story we opened with. Empress Irene became regent for her young son, Constantine VI, after her husband's death in 780. For years, she effectively ruled the empire in his name, and by most accounts, she ruled it well, navigating military campaigns, religious controversy, and diplomatic relationships with the same skill as any male emperor before her. The problem, from Irene's perspective, was that regency has a built-in expiration date. Constantine grew up, and as he approached adulthood, the obvious, inevitable, and under normal circumstances, entirely appropriate expectation was that he would begin ruling in his own right, with his mother stepping back into a subordinate, ceremonial role. Irene did not accept this outcome. What followed was years of escalating political maneuvering between mother and son, including a period where Constantine briefly asserted his independent authority, only for Irene to maneuver her way back into power through court allies loyal specifically to her rather than to the dynasty as a whole. The final confrontation, in the year 797, ended with Irene's supporters seizing her adult son and blinding him in the same palace where he'd been born, a mutilation so severe, according to some accounts, that he died from the wound shortly afterward, though the exact circumstances remain historically debated. With her son eliminated as a political rival, Irene did something no woman in Roman or Byzantine history had ever done before. She took the throne not as a regent, not as a court ruler acting in someone else's name, but as sole reigning Basilius emperor in her own right, using the masculine title rather than a feminine equivalent. Because Byzantine political language had no established concept of a woman legitimately holding supreme power alone, she ruled for 5 more years before being deposed in a palace coup and exiled to a monastery, where she died within a year of a common enough ending for a Byzantine ruler, male or female, whose luck in the empire's brutal succession politics finally ran out. Set aside the extreme case of Irene for a moment, because most Byzantine empresses never seized the throne outright or blinded a rival. For the majority, the danger was quieter, but constant. An empress who fell out of favor, whether through political scheming by rivals, a husband's changed affections, or simply failing to produce an heir, faced a fairly standard menu of consequences that recur throughout Byzantine history. Forced retirement to a convent, which was essentially a permanent, socially acceptable form of political exile, formal repudiation, and replacement by a new wife, sometimes while the previous empress was still alive, and simply set aside, or, in more severe political circumstances, actual physical mutilation of the same kind used against male rivals. There are documented cases of empresses and princesses having their noses cut off specifically to render them ineligible for a future strategic remarriage that a rival faction feared. Beyond these dramatic worst-case outcomes, ordinary daily life inside the Byzantine imperial court was itself a constant exercise in careful political navigation. The court was famously, elaborately hierarchical and ceremonial, a word Byzantine entered the English language specifically because of how convoluted and indirect Byzantine court politics and bureaucracy became. Every relationship, every alliance, every seemingly minor social interaction between courtiers, eunuch officials, church leaders, and military commanders carried potential political weight. An empress who wanted to survive, let alone thrive, needed constant awareness of shifting alliances. A genuinely difficult skill that had nothing to do with any formal training and everything to do with pure political instinct, developed under threat of permanent removal, or worse. And yet, despite all of this, or arguably because Byzantine political culture was unusually willing to let capable individuals rise regardless of gender, So long as they could actually hold power, the Byzantine Empire produced a genuinely remarkable number of powerful, historically significant female rulers compared to almost any other pre-modern civilization. Theodora's legal reforms, expanding protections for women including laws against forced prostitution, expanded rights in divorce proceedings, and property rights for women to remain part of Byzantine law for centuries after her death, reshaping the legal position of ordinary Byzantine women, not just empresses, in ways that outlasted her own reign by hundreds of years. Irene, whatever the brutal circumstances of her ascension, is also remembered for presiding over the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, a major church council that resolved the Byzantine iconoclasm controversy, a religious dispute that had torn the empire apart for decades over whether religious icons constituted idolatry. Her role in ending this crisis is considered one of the most consequential religious policy decisions of the entire Byzantine period, entirely independent of how she came to hold the authority to make it. Later empresses like Zoe and Theodora, a different Theodora, ruling in the 11th century, it took the throne as genuinely joint sole rulers. Sisters governing the empire together without a husband or son standing above them at all, an arrangement almost without parallel anywhere else in medieval history. What made this possible wasn't that Byzantine society viewed women as political equals in any modern sense, or it emphatically did not. What made it possible was that Byzantine political survival depended so heavily on raw capability, ruthlessness, and the ability to actually command loyalty, that a genuinely skilled operator could rise to the absolute top of the system regardless of gender, provided she was willing to play the same brutal game every other Byzantine ruler, male or female, had to play to stay there. Being an empress in the Byzantine Empire meant existing inside one of history's most sophisticated, most ceremonially refined, and most politically lethal courts, a position that could make you one of the most powerful rulers on the planet, or cost you your position, your face, or your life, sometimes within the same decade. The women who succeeded at it weren't passive figures waiting to be married off and forgotten. They were, almost without exception, exceptionally skilled political operators who understood that in Byzantium, safety was never guaranteed by title alone. It had to be actively, continuously, and sometimes ruthlessly maintained. Irene blinded her own son to keep her throne. Theodora talked an emperor out of fleeing a burning city and rewrote the legal status of women across the empire. Neither of them got there by accident. If you enjoyed this video, there are more stories on the channel about what it was like to be someone completely different, in a completely different era. See you in the next one.